Welcome back to the programme. I'm Khalil Charles. Last year, South African university campuses were in the spotlight. There was controversy about removing the statue of Cecil Rhodes and also the controversy over Fees Must Fall, a movement which mobilised thousands of students in protest against the government. However, universities across the country are still facing many difficulties. Some of those problems include the lack of student housing, the low staff salaries, and demands by some students that the Afrikaans language be removed from being taught in classes. Adama Munu has more on this.
The University of Pretoria in South Africa last week Friday closed down its campuses after protests over the use of Afrikaans as the official teaching language. Outside of the university were some South Africans defiantly chanting, "Afrikaans will stay."
This current generation is tired of nursing the Africans. We are tired of having this white privilege in the institution. In as much as they are passionate of saying that Africans will stay in this institution, we are very passionate and of saying that the Africans will be eradicated.
Ons is hier om te sê Afrikaans is ons taal. Hoekom mag ons hieroor veg nie?
Some students gathered at the university praying for racial integration.
Amen. A white person in South Africa has got a future. Amen. A black child in South Africa has got a future. Amen. Everyone has got a future, and we need to stand strong, together, united, and declare that.
Student demonstrations have long played a part in South African politics. In 1976, black high school students marched against the apartheid regime's plan to enforce Afrikaans as the language of instruction. Now, more than 20 years after the end of minority white rule, students of all races say they are protesting against the lack of transformation at the country's universities, including that of high tuition costs, as well as the official use of Afrikaans on some campuses. The University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg said 14 students were arrested after allegedly setting a bus on fire and burning a mattress outside the library to protest school fees. Members of the student protest group FeesMustFall tweeted up to 20 demonstrators had been arrested. This comes in as South Africa's finance minister on Wednesday hiked taxes and targets against what he called a wasteful and corrupt government. Africa's most developed economy is struggling with shrinking growth and unemployment running at 25%.
There's no doubt about the fact that we're in crisis, and that helps. It helps to understand that we have a serious challenge in South Africa and that we have to do extraordinary things to get us out of that crisis or a set of challenges and meet them in a creative and constructive and firm way. The one area that government is absolutely clear on is that we are not imposing austerity on our people. All these cuts will not mean a reduction in social grants, will not be meaning a reduction in hospital services or education services.
The two struggles of fending off South Africa's difficult past and its present financial plight has found its platform in the country's higher education sector. What is certain is that students are prepared to struggle against both at whatever cost. Adama Munu, Africa This Week.
Now joining us for this is Vito, Laterza, a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Oslo, and the research associate also at the Centre of African Studies at the University of Cape Town. And we also have on the line Majaletje Mathume from the group Open Stellenbosch. It's the main student activist group calling for a change to the Afrikaner language policy at the University of Stellenbosch. I'll begin, if I can, with Mathume. And this is becoming a very volatile issue. We've seen what happened in Pretoria. What's the situation in your own university with regard to the way the policy of Afrikaans is being accepted or, if you like, being asked to be removed?
Yeah, I think, thanks for having me on your show.
Pleasure.
I think the most important thing to begin with that we need to recognize in this whole debate around language is that we are not protesting about language per se. This is not just an issue of language. It's about how Afrikaans much like it has been used during apartheid, in the same institutions that were, such as Stellenbosch, which is the institution that came up with the theoretical foundations of apartheid, that language is being used in the same manner post-1994. So what we have here is that people engage with us as if we are talking about we just want to deny people a right to learn in their language. But that's not our issue. Our issue is how Afrikaans is used as a medium of exclusion, and it is used to harbor racism, and it is also used to exert power over an institution which is supposed to be a public institution serving the rest of South Africans, but Afrikaans is used to ensure that this institution, Stellenbosch University, only serves the interest of the minority, much like it has been happening in apartheid. So that's the crush of the matter.
It would be wrong to say, Mathume, that the Afrikaner language is only the language spoken by the white minority. The African language, as far as I understand, is the majority of people who speak it are actually black. So, and the question here is also the fact that Afrikaans, with all the other languages, is one of the official languages of South Africa. So why then is there so much antagonism and so much animosity against the use of the language?
Yeah, that's the interesting part, right? If you come to Stellenbosch University, given the fact that you just mentioned, Stellenbosch University is in the Western Cape, where we have a lot of black Afrikaans-speaking people. But the way Afrikaans is being used in the Stellenbosch context, in the Department of Afrikaans, they even call it Afrikaans Dutch. The reason they put Afrikaans Dutch there is racially cleans the language of black people. So you have a situation where in a province where majority of Afrikaans speaking people are black, in the university that's not the case. There are few black Afrikaans speaking students in Stellenbosch University, despite it being an institution that enforces a medium of Afrikaans as the default medium of tuition. So this is not just about that language. It is not just about the language having a place in South Africa. It's about how Afrikaans people, white Afrikaans people, use their language to exclude even black Afrikaans-speaking people. So language is being used in this context as a proxy for race. Okay. That's the crush of the matter.
Can I go to Vito now and ask you pretty much the same question, and whether you concur with some of the statements that have been made there with regard to the way in which the language is seen by white South Africans? Do you agree that that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think without repeating what Majaletje is saying, which I think is mostly in agreement, for instance, in this protest, we're not really seeing Afrikaans speakers who are not white protesting, asking for Afrikaans to stay there. So, the people we're seeing in the news that say Afrikaans must stay, we feel under attack, are white Afrikaners. I mean, that is the matter of the fact, both in Stellenbosch. I mean, now in the last days, we've seen a University of Pretoria, and we're seeing also a University of Free State in the last days, how things have heated up there. So, of course, this is an argument that the University of Stellenbosch management has been using, and other people in the Afrikaner community have been using. Also, if you look at staff and the student makeup, transformation has made some headway. I mean, for our kind of non-South African public, transformation means basically trying to get a representative makeup of the population out there, and we are very far from that at all levels of the levels of professional life in South Africa, and universities are at the center of this. If you look at that, there are not many black Afrikaans speakers as staff members. There are not many, the students, the ratio of white students in Stellenbosch and the other kind of traditionally Afrikaans-speaking university is still disproportionately white. So I think in that way we cannot separate the Afrikaans question with the race question, which is the much bigger question at stake with FeesMustFall and the wider student movement beyond the University of Stellenbosch and the universities where Afrikaans has become an issue.
Vito, how must we understand the way in which the distribution of the Afrikaans language is used in universities? Why are there some universities that have it and others that don't? What's the process that's taking place here?
Well, I mean, this has to do with the South African context and the context of how the South African communities have evolved, and very much connected to apartheid and the segregation of different communities. South Africa is very regional, so it's got very different racial and ethnic makeups as we go in different regions. So what happens is that where you have Afrikaans-speaking universities, it means that you have a large population of white Afrikaners. Usually they are the majority among the whites, i.e. versus the English-speaking whites, or anyway a very substantial group. So that would be the true for Stellenbosch, would be true for Bloemfontein, where University of the Free State is, would be true for University of Pretoria, for instance, to name a few. So the issues here, it's also about these regional balances. These regional balances have played in a split system. So what we had during apartheid and kind of have remained as basic structure, unfortunately, in the post-apartheid South Africa, is that the better resourced universities, which were the formerly white universities, have remained basically, have struggled to transform, especially in terms of staff, but also in terms of student numbers. They are not representative of the population out there, which means whites are disproportionately represented. So what happens is that some universities have much more English-speaking influence in terms of white cultures and white communities, and some of these have more Afrikaans-speaking. What happens is that there are then all the other universities, which were formerly black universities, that are much less resourced, and even under current situation, even with more government funding after the end of apartheid, they still cannot compete in terms of resources and funding and how much they can attract even from the private sector and prestige with the formerly white universities.
I'm going to go back to Majaletje and ask you about the response there's been, if any, from the government. What are the South African government saying about the use of Afrikaners in the universities? What kind of direction are they giving people?
Okay, this is my question, right?
Yes, indeed. I'm asking you.
Yeah, look, throughout last year, as we were, protesting about the language issue, the South African government, there's a policy of the use of language in higher education. And that policy is pretty much in line with the Constitution. So, and that in extension means that there has to be, it's a constitutional imperative in post-1994 South Africa that in interpretation of the Constitution, legislations have to be biased towards the groups which were previously disadvantaged on the basis of race or either gender or either class, right? So that constitutional imperative, as we are speaking currently, I can say that Stellenbosch University's language policy can be found to be unconstitutional. So the South African government is clear. That's why it has been a bit difficult although to be fair, we expected the government to engage with us better, because last year we were invited to Parliament precisely because of this language issue by the Portfolio Committee on Higher Education, and we both agree with the committee that there is nothing vague about where the Constitution and the policy of languages in higher education is concerned and the direction of that. But the problem with Stellenbosch is that Stellenbosch University's council consists of white Afrikaans old men who were part of the apartheid structure, people who are in charge of the apartheid economy, which is in place as we speak, right? Because towards the end of the year, we agreed with management, we agreed with deans of faculties, we agreed with Senate, we agreed with Student Representative Council that we will change the language policy. The practice in the classroom will change while the process of changing the language policy is initiated. But when the university, the rector's management team went to council meeting, council actually reverted them back, and they said, no, you can't change this language policy. You must stick to the old one. So this is the fundamental problem as well. There's a disproportion distribution of power in our country, such that old white men who were the people who held the structures of apartheid can still dictate what happens in public institutions, even though the assumption globally is that the apartheid structures are no longer in place. And this is what we are struggling with.
Do you think that these protests are going to continue? Do you think that people are not going to accept the question of having this tuition in Afrikaans?
Look, as we speak currently, we're still regrouping as Open Stellenbosch, standing in solidarity with our other comrades at Northwest University, University of Pretoria, and University of Free State. So certainly, there is no way that you can sit in a classroom where you don't understand what you're being taught. It's not like we don't want to learn in Afrikaans. I myself, last year, have been in a classroom where literally I can't understand anything. And this is not something new to the university. When I applied to the university, I was assured that I'm not going to face that problem.
You're in the final year of your studies, aren't you? The final year of your studies, is that right?
Yes.
So it's quite a problem that you can't understand what's being said in the class. That is quite a huge problem. Can I come to Vito and ask you about the other difficulties that were alluded to in our report there? And that centers around the financial insecurity or the financial weakness of the university in terms of salaries, in terms of lack of accommodation for students. Has this been an ongoing situation? How long has that been continuing in this way?
I mean, there's major differences between different universities. So, I mean, I was making a difference between universities who have much better resources than others. So here, the issue with the higher education is that basically for the last few years, state funding has actually decreased, which has basically favored the more competitive university with much better prestige and all the, alumni network, the kind of, old white men that Mathume was talking about.
Sure.
So, that has shifted quite a lot, the number of funding, the amount of funding that comes from the state versus private fundings and fees. That's why fees have shot up as well, because basically it's been one of the three major incomes for universities. So what we are seeing now with the FeesMustFall, I mean, with the acceptance by government for this year so far, that fees will not increase, government is putting in much more money and is trying to put in much more money